10 of the busiest trains in the country are in South London. That's also related to the fact that there's a 12% increase in ridership in relation to South London, and 2 of the boroughs have no TfL infrastructure whatsoever. There are more underground stations outside London than there are in the sub-region. As a consequence of that, we have an issue relating to accessibility and environmental consequences. That's encapsulated in the fact that 80% of journeys in my borough take place by car. Only 22% of residents regularly use public transport for getting to work or accessing other services, including town centre facilities. That's replicated in the other boroughs as well. And there is a significant deficiency in relation to reliability. We rely on southern mainline and coastal services, and in the period in 2017, 29.5% of those trains were late or delayed for some reason or cancelled. In the period between the 11th of December and 7th of January 2017, that rose to 35.4% of trains late, delayed or cancelled. Given the fact that a lot of our residents are very dependent on rail infrastructure for accessing jobs and employment in the central activity zone, that is having an adverse impact on their quality of life, but also the economic prosperity of the sub-region. The South London sub-region has been working to develop a growth proposition for our area, and we have identified that transport and infrastructure is resulting in a 15% sub-optimisation in economic potential. That's also replicated in the context of the fact that during the recession, the sub-region lost more jobs than any other sub-region in London and has been slower to recover. Now that is hidden by the fact that we have quite economically active residents who are relatively wealthy in London terms, but actually most of that employment is in the central activity zone and not in the sub-region. As a consequence of that, we have an issue relating to accessibility to central London, but also across the sub-region itself to access employment areas within the sub-region and growth areas which have been identified by the Mayor in the draft London plan. So some of the information about the economic performance which may be of interest to members of the Assembly are that in Kingston, which is a strategic town centre within London, it's the 4th highest retail centre in terms of value, £2.1 billion of retail expenditure per annum, is dependent on Kingston Station, which has 4 trains an hour from Waterloo. And some of those are the busiest trains I've mentioned earlier on. So a part of our solution going forward, rather than describing the problem, has been very much about working with the Mayor to develop an infrastructure for good growth plan for South London. We're also working with our subnational partners, our subnational transport boards in the Greater South East, in looking at what the impacts are for our sub-region. Frequently, our residents who complain about this quite regularly in resident surveys feel they can't access trains because they're already full by the time they get to the London border. As a consequence of that, there's a need for us to work across the region and into the South East region and work with the new South East subnational transport board. We need to look at that in terms of a holistic system. Metroisation was keenly supported by all of the boroughs, all 5 boroughs in the South London Partnership, across all political parties at that time, and it was deeply disappointing that that was cancelled by the current Secretary of State when that was not progressed after Patrick McLaughlin had agreed to do so with the previous Mayor. That would have enormously relieved access for our residents, and it would have improved relatively cheaply access and development opportunities for further development in certain parts of the sub-region. The example I'd use is the London Cancer Hub, which is in my borough. It's a nationally significant intervention. It's identified as a strategic regeneration area under the new London plan, and that is dependent on a station which receives 1 train an hour outside peak areas, Belmont Station. The previous Commissioner for Transport, when we came to the previous London Enterprise Plan, I had to check it on his phone, and he found it was extraordinary that heavy infrastructure which exists in London is not being exploited to its fullest effect. The intervention which would be required for that to have 4 to 6 trains an hour would cost £21 million. But that is absolutely dependent on metroisation, absolutely dependent on the investment which will come from Transport for London, having oversight in order that that infrastructure could be supported better. And the South London Partnership strongly supports the metroisation of South London infrastructure. I'll finish my final point on this, which is a point that was made by the Assembly in 2002. The Assembly considered Transport and Outer London at that time, and it talked about metroisation, the necessary need for infrastructure improvements across all of the areas in the South London sub-region, particularly in relation to the Brighton Main Line. Talking about the future needs for infrastructure improvement associated with that subnational board and the interests of South London, Brighton Main Line improvement for Croydon particularly, but more widely for the southeast and for South London is crucial. Metroisation of the South London transport infrastructure through heavy rail will be highly sub-optimised unless that infrastructure is improved, because it occupies the space already. Even with Thameslink, by 2041, that route will be completely full and standing room only and overcrowded. So there is a need for us to look at this as a whole with our partners in the Greater South East.
Thank you very much for that. And I think you made some interesting points also about the need to the orbital routes, not just always getting into the central zone. I'm sure we'll pick that up later. Stephen, do you want to outline the main challenges as you see them?
I think I'd echo Neil's point, really. The issue that the overwhelming challenge for London's rail network is capacity, or lack of it. And that's capacity as well as for passengers, for freight as well. There is a strong case for rail freight in London. It's there is a strong debate between TfL and the rail freight operators about what freight should operate at what time, but I don't think there's any disagreement that having more freight by rail in London is important, because it reduces lorry traffic on the roads. But so capacity is the overwhelming challenge, and I think it's capacity. I think the metroisation point is a clear one, but actually it's what that leads to. TfL and the mayor, successive mayors, have tried to join up rail and development. For example, and the Barking Riverside scheme is a good example of that. I'd say that isn't well done at national level, and because national government controls at the moment most of the London rail network, that means that the priority of siting of improving rail services in London so as to enable housing and other development isn't given the priority that it needs. So capacity is clearly the big challenge going forward. I'd say there were 3 other main challenges. One is service quality. The fact is that the service quality on London's railways, well, I'm a Thameslink user, so I can speak about personal experience.
At the moment.
Scars on my back and all that. But I think there's and linked to that, the quality of the stations. The work we've done has overwhelmingly showed that the quality of service provided, not just by when TfL controls national rail services on the London Overground, but when other devolved authorities do it. Merseyrail, which has had much less investment than London Overground, went from being misery rail to being one of the best performing railways in the country. And that's because there's a local focus, a proper contract. The Welsh Government's just gone down a rather similar route, to a long-term concession, and that's because there's much more immediate accountability to, well, the likes of this committee, among others, and That means that the quality of the stations, the trains, stations being staffed from first to last train, compared with, you know, on a lot of outer London and home counties railway services, even at quite big stations, it feels like a free railway after about 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. There's no staff around. So service quality is a huge issue for passengers, particularly late at night, but just generally. A third challenge is fares. This isn't an issue for London directly, but it is an issue indirectly, because the failure to provide flexible, smart ticketing outside London has an impact on London. We've talked to people who drive in from Kent to, say, Rotherhithe to access to get on the TfL network, because they are, for example, women working on job shares 2 days a week. The anytime fare is simply unaffordable for them. I know TfL has its financial challenges, but if you look at what's been happening to full-time season ticket revenue and travel in the home county in London, the southeast, wider southeast, you'll see that this is a really big issue. The lack of flexible ticketing. Arguably, it discriminates particularly against women who work part-time. So fares reform seems to us to be an issue. And the final issue is accessibility. There's been a move towards greater accessibility at the stations in London, but it's not been matched. We're just starting to see some accessible humps go in at the Thameslink stations, new Thameslink stations. They're having to be retrofitted, which gives you a sense of the failure to think about this compared with, say, Crossrail or some of the TfL services. So I think those are the 4 challenges: capacity, service quality, fares reform and accessibility.
Thank you very much indeed. That's very helpful. Helena.
There's not much more I can say apart from endorse the challenges that Niall and Stephen have both put forward. I think one thing that sort of binds issues around reliability, accessibility and fares together is the challenge which doesn't affect central London so much, but will be affecting sort of areas around London, which is that of the ageing population. That combined with changing work patterns and more older people sort of working longer in the future is going to have an impact on what users want from our rail systems as they come into London. And that affects accessibility of the rail systems, it affects the quality of service, and it affects fares, because it may well be more off-peak working, more part-time working. Reflecting a little bit more on the reliability aspect, it's not just about trains running on time. I think this matches with some of the points that Stephen was saying, that if you're undertaking a journey, you don't just want to know that this leg will work. You want to know that the whole journey, from start to finish, will work for you. And for some passengers, that will mean knowing that there's going to be a taxi at the rail station at the far end. Once you're in sort of more rural areas, knowing that there's going to be station staff on hand to help you, knowing that the lifts are working, so that you know you can actually do that journey. There's plenty of people sort of, if you're a very confident traveller with a disability at the moment, you can probably just about manage, depending on your confidence and your type of disability. But it can be very, very difficult. So we need to start thinking about sort of how do we incorporate sort of more, get away from thinking that sort of everybody's sort of young, working sort of 9 to 5 in central London.
To think about the whole population,
yes.
Yeah. David.
Thank you. I mean, I think from the business perspective, the mission critical thing really for the rail network is that it connects the homes in London and around the southeast with the jobs, and particularly those jobs in the highly productive centre of London. That's the most critical thing of all. And in terms of that, I thought your sort of unscientific Twitter poll sounded about right to me, to be honest. I mean, the reliability figure struck me as higher than it should be. I suspect that is partly related to, some of the issues that Stephen mentioned, some of the, terrible failures largely of planning around some of the commuter routes coming into London. But capacity continues to be the big challenge. And I think sort of our biggest fear, to be perfectly honest, is that we succumb to complacency almost, that, that London has improved very significantly over the last couple of decades, linked particularly to the emergence of this institution, the Mayoralty and Transport for London and all the associated sort of architecture. We've done much better in planning for the future and investment. But if we look back at the sort of, the decades preceding that, then, the story was one of, very real failure, of considerable underinvestment in the London transport infrastructure. And, we've spent 2 decades making good on that, to be honest. And playing catch-up. The worst thing we could possibly do now is to sort of think, okay, Thameslink is coming to an end, Crossrail's almost done, now's the time for an investment holiday. That would be completely wrong. What we need to do here in London is to keep planning and keep investing for the future.
Absolutely, it's too tempting for people to put their feet up now. I think we've done London, isn't it? What about, are there any other comments about the impact of these challenges on passengers and around accessibility to the network that anyone else wants to add? Niall?
Yes, it's absolutely definitely the case that the transport and access to, and rail in particular in the sub-region is the top priority, one of the top priorities for our residents. When we ask them, as we have recently in my own borough, what the top priorities for residents are in terms of the public services they receive, in the context of everything else that we do, transport was second. So we have no role particularly in transport commissioning other than advocating and lobbying. But it is something which we need to respond to. And echoing what my colleague said earlier on in relation to the infrastructure improvements within London are undoubtedly been welcome and incredibly successful. Undoubtedly sort of like stories which I can tell you about. For example, we had an investor conference in Sutton which was for showcasing of key development sites. And then on that day, of course, Southern Rail decided that they would have a strike. So obviously those investors didn't come. We couldn't showcase the opportunities. So those are the sort of things that we need to address. So that has a genuine, real impact on the ability of us in South London and Sutton specifically to meet our objectives and the mayoral ambition for housing growth, for example. If investors can't come, residents can't come. As a consequence of that, we need to think very, very carefully about how we deal with Outer London's requirements for better connectivity within sub-regions, and I think that would be the case in some of the other sub-regions as well, but also in terms of recognising there's connectivity into London, but also out of London and within sub-regions for us to be making sure that we maximise the opportunities for residents to access jobs and employment, but also to have a good quality of life and minimise the environmental consequences of being so car dependent.
Anyone else want to come in on that? Stephen?
I think there's a thing here about joining up rail strategy with wider mayoral objectives. For example, the issue of air quality and actually, as Niall has said, reducing car use in outer London. Rail it should be part of that, and there are opportunities to improve that. There's the Mayor's transport strategy talks about more orbital rail. There's opportunities in West London for that, but I think there's also about applying the healthy streets priority that's in the Mayor's transport strategy to rail, which is about good links to stations. Helena said the important, it's really important. This is about door-to-door journeys. It's about making sure that people can get to and from stations easily, and that's one of the things that I think puts people off in outer London. Sometimes stations are across your carriageways, that there isn't a proper thinking about this. We did some work with Abellio based on their Dutch parent body on called Fixing the Link, which is work they've done across the Dutch railway network, looking at how you make the links between stations and the surrounding area better for pedestrians. And we did a bit of work in a place like Colchester, where the stations and the main stations on the north side of the town, there's dual carriageways and roundabouts and things. And simple things can be done to make those things work better. And I think there's a need to give, in thinking about rail in London, to give a lot of give more thought to how the railway stations relate to the surrounding area. That's true of underground as well as mainline, by the way, stations, by the way. So as to make them genuinely accessible in the broad sense, and to think about ways in which those can be accessed easily by foot and bike, so you don't get so much car travel to stations. I think that could make a real difference in the Outer London story particularly.
Can I move us on just to pick your brains about how London's network compares internationally, or even nationally to other cities? You know, do you have any information that maybe I'd go to David first? You know, how do we compare? Because it always feels that we've got such a creaking, ageing infrastructure, but actually, do we in reality?
Well, I think if we went around the country, we'd probably detect some strong responses from that from
Yes, I'm sure.
other parts of the country who feel rather strongly that they have been relatively neglected, and they do have a point. You know, we have been underinvesting in transport infrastructure elsewhere in the country. At the international level, it's probably a mixed picture, actually. I was actually flicking through looking at the sort of the New York Times yesterday, and of course, you know, one of our principal global competitors, but their transport infrastructure is in a terrible mess. You know, they are only now really trying to think about how they modernise their subway system, and you know, they've got someone with TfL experience to try and help them to do it. You know, elsewhere in Europe, I guess the picture is a bit more mixed. You know, some of the European capital cities, you know, have good public transport networks. I guess if we go to smaller European cities, you know, it's a slightly different challenge, but it's somewhat easier in terms of the geography and the scale. But I think, you know, we are doing respectably, but, you know, these things have long time scales. So, you know, if we don't continue to plan and continue to invest, then in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, you know, we're storing up terrible problems for ourselves.
Helena, do you have any examples of internationally or nationally where there's better practice than London?
I don't think there's anywhere I'd say was completely better practice. The picture is mixed, so there are other cities with similar sort of ageing infrastructure that is operating at or over capacity. There are some cities where the infrastructure sort of works better from the crowding perspective and the reliability perspective, but isn't perhaps sort of performing still on the accessibility angle and meeting everybody's needs. So it's more a case of drawing sort of bits of best practice from different aspects of different cities, rather than sort of any one being above or below on every aspect.
Stephen, you look at this internationally.
Yes,
do you have any places we should be looking at?
I think that there is some good practices, David and Helena have said, in other places. I mean, London does have a very dense rail network. I think the issue of devolution and the boundaries between different authorities, between local, regional or sub-regional and national bodies seems to be a common problem. But it is the case that, say, German and French cities seem to have more ability to manage their local and regional rail networks than London does. I take Niall's point about transport for the South East, and actually I think Hertfordshire suggested the need for a kind of grouping to manage London's railways and other the London South East Rail network, with the surrounding counties, and there's been quite a lot of interest in that.
Come on to that in a bit.
And that, you know, if you go to German cities, you find that there are what are known as Verkehrsverbund, which are in fact that they are, you know, say, Munich City Council and the surrounding local authorities and transport operators who together manage the transport network and let contracts to Deutsche Bahn or indeed to you know, bodies like National Express and Arriva to manage, to run the local rail network. And that devolution, you see that in Greater Paris as well. So I think that's one area where in in stopping the devolution of local rail services and refusing to really think about sub-regional management, the current government policy is flying against what other what is happening elsewhere in the world,
and that works.
And it works. I think it's just what I think I would just say. I think it's almost inconceivable that if TfL had been in control of the Thameslink project, it would have ended up like this, because TfL would have had an incentive, of being, among other things, hauled before this committee, to not, to call a halt when it was clear that the new timetable wasn't going to work. And I take David's point. I think your Twitter poll is influenced by some of the mess that's happened there, complete unpredictability. And I don't think any of the railways which are managed by the devolved authorities could have possibly made such a mess of it as has happened here.
I'm looking forward to GTR and Network Rail coming before us on the 25th of this month. Now, briefly, do you want to come in on this before I move on?
Just in terms of the international comparisons, as the committee will be aware, we are looking in with TfL in partnership to extend the tram in South London. As part of that, the thing that I'd like to draw to the attention, we have looked at how small and medium-sized cities in France, for example, are able to build that infrastructure relatively quickly and do that autonomously with support of government and to be able to finance it differently. And we've looked at, for example, Strasbourg and Besançon, and those are sort of similar sizes to Sutton and Merton in terms of population, and they're able to finance and fund us into that infrastructure by issuing bonds independently, given a very wide beam in relation to their autonomy and authority to raise money within the markets, which doesn't exist for us easily. So some of the stuff which may be underpinning, and some of the German examples is really important as well, but some of the stuff that may be underpinning that, more reliability, more accountability, much more democratic transparency, is the ability to finance it and a real genuine connection with the costs of the infrastructure by the citizens who are responsible or are using it.
Look at finance later. That sounds very interesting. Right, let's look at how we plan demand for rail services. Steve.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. A couple of comments, Niall. Thank you for your championing of Outer London. I think it's very true about this resentment. I think in Outer London it's been felt over many years about the imbalance of investment. It's good to hear from yourself around that. And just a last comment before I pursue that is the 1 in 5 journeys by public transport in the southwest sector is shocking. And until we get that infrastructure investment, it would be rather fanciful that people get out of their cars until we get that. So anyway, forecasting demand. We've heard already talk about congestion, about increase in ridership and capacity as a major challenge. That was your evidence that you gave earlier. And we understand that London's population will grow potentially to 10.8 million by 2041. So there's some issues there. However, there's an imbalance. I want your comments really about how you judge this imbalance about the way that people's work practices are changing, which they are, and the way that people, for example, shop differently. Shops are coming to people and elsewhere. So my first question to all of you really is how is your perception about how the demand forecasts are being made? Your comments around that, Niall.
So we principally look at the evidence base for this is included in the mayoral supporting documentation for the draft London plan at the moment, particularly in terms of the strategic housing land assessment, and how that is completely and utterly dependent, for example, on Crossrail 2 being implemented. So we know, for example, in our sub-region that the high level of housing growth that's expected to meet the London plan objectives and that increase in population by 2041 is completely dependent on infrastructure improvement, and including Crossrail 2. However, we also have the remedial problem. And we have a remedial issue in terms of the infrastructure not being able to cope, as I've already outlined, with the existing population growth and existing increase in ridership. So 16% increase is a part of the reason why I would argue, contend, why the reliability of the infrastructure is so poor. It's incapable of accommodating the demands being put on it at the moment. So the issue for
what
us...
we want to understand, Niall, is also, and others will continue, is the robustness of this, because we can say it'll go up 60%, and I've seen morning peak 50% by 2041. But what I'd also like to explore is how dependable are those figures and the basis we are them now. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's fine. So we are dependent, obviously, on the best knowledge we have available, and on the basis of the projections in terms of population that we have, which are relatively reasonable and have been tested through the mayoral strategies, then we need to think about what we do in terms of the prediction, in terms of the infrastructure requirements and the location of that growth, which is also related to the London plan objectives. My contestation is the fact that those areas where growth is expected in outer London are already underserved by infrastructure. So it's not only the new infrastructure that's required, it's the existing infrastructure is completely inadequate. Some of the areas where greatest growth is expected under the Mayor's new London plan are in areas where Pete's on level 1 and 2. So we have already a problem in terms of the access to infrastructure for those communities as it exists at the moment, let alone additional growth. So the solutions to that aren't only going to be about heavy infrastructure. We have to shift and change our policies, for example, around digital infrastructure, the nature of work and employment, having a look at how we get cheaper, easier implementable solutions which enable greater mobility. But also our policies need to be about encouraging town centre development and concentrating economic activity in the town centres in outer London. So we can't rely on that massive heavy infrastructure to support it. And that then is a challenge then for our overall infrastructure pattern. The geometry of infrastructure in London is very much about pointing into the middle of the city. So we need to think about what that looks like in terms of what that means around the edge. And that's something which we need to use all of the tools at our disposal, including other transport measures, including improvements in bus accessibility, the tram, for example, key for South London in the medium term, as well as encouraging other forms of transport access.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the point's well made, because there's two issues. There's the issue of areas where there isn't the infrastructure. So Sutton, as you just said, is the worst served borough, I believe, in London. TfL is not pleasant, other than buses, of course. But then there's a need there already, but there's also the growth need. And what I'd be interested in exploring is, you've referred to, the Mayor always refers to the link between housing and demand and infrastructure. And so Croydon, as a borough, kind of gets that, but have a potential around that. So again, Stephen, your thoughts around from your company?
I think one of the problems here actually is that traditional tools used by transport planners aren't very good at this, and they're not good in two main ways. Firstly, that link between transport and development isn't well organised and isn't well represented in the way in which transport demand's talked about. It tends to be, and what it doesn't take account of is is the difference in travel demand about where you place development. So it doesn't tend to, traditional transport planning tools don't tend to take account of, there'll be a lot less car use if you place new development near railway stations and you provide a decent railway service, or indeed a fast bus service actually. And secondly, the kind of way in which you design the developments. Sutton's Bedford development, which is has much less car parking, generates much less travel, provided we put in things like car clubs and so on, than a very low density development. Some of the, particularly some of the commercial developments on, say, the Lee Valley or out in West London have generated a lot of car travel. So, so transport planning tools aren't very good at that level. They're also not very good at spotting the changes in trends. There was a recent report which the committee might want to take a look at, done by an independent commission on travel demand, which pointed out exactly, as you've said, that huge changes in work and shopping patterns, such that there's actually reducing numbers of trips happening, particularly in cities, and that's changed. And the report highlights that current transport policy trends don't take account of that, and particularly, just outside the Greater London borders, councils, the way in which roads are being planned assumes huge future growth in traffic that simply may not be there. So I think there's a need, and the passenger demand forecasting handbook, which is how national rail is planned, it doesn't take account of any of this. In fact, one of the reasons why the Department for Transport has been so resistant to fares reform, we think, is because they think it's going to lose them lots of money, because they've not taken account of the changes in working patterns, housing, and how people live.
Not taking account of this?
No, they're not taking account of this at all. There's a very interesting graph in that Commission's report which talks about Leeds' future demand in its development plan, based on the way in which transport plans are delivered, which shows even the lowest growth forecast implies much greater growth in traffic and trips than has happened in Leeds for 30 years. And the point is, I've mentioned Leeds, but the point is made generally. I know there are intense debates between Transport for London and the Department for Transport over travel demand, over the way in which, over who's right about this kind of stuff. I think, by the way, it underlies some of the arguments between TfL and the government over future demand, surface access demand at Heathrow, for the Heathrow third runway.
Yes.
By the way, these technical arguments about what kinds of forecasts you use, whether you predict past trends continuing and so on, versus taking account of the changes, I think are a really important issue. As I say, it also links to the join up between transport and planning, which government has been traditionally terrible at a national level.
And of course, as I said earlier, that there is the issue about the demand issue of people coming into the centre, but of course the orbital demand, and where's that? Helen, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think Stephen's point about sort of the models not taking the new developments into account properly, and the links between transport facilities at those developments. Just to highlight a case, we did some work quite a few years ago now looking at New Delhi Metro, and a couple of the stations along there were when it first opened, were performing very poorly, much below expected from the models. And what we think was happening was that because of the way in which they designed the metro station, with a huge car park in front of it, buses the wrong side of the car park, very few sort of connecting shops and things, that actually it wasn't creating a pleasant place for people to travel to in an easy journey, so people weren't using it. And of course that sort of level of nuance isn't in those in the typical transport planning tools that we use. I think there's a question about, as you say, about the sort of orbital versus central trips, that we tend to sort of look at past demand to predict future demand, which isn't sensible, whether it's talking about changing work practices or just even changing preferences around our transport system. And a focus on peak hour, with changing work practices, focusing sort of on what happens in the morning peak is not going to lead us to sensible sort of solutions. Another limitation of many traditional sort of transport planning models is really that they're not very sensitive to all of the variety of choices that people can make in response to a change in the system. Whether that's not do the trip at all, start doing their shopping online, changing routes, changing destination. It tends to look at changing routes, but none of the others. So there's a lot of sort of questions around the figures that we're using.
There's also the issue about the relocation of businesses and work itself, because some large-scale employers are moving out. I can think of the Home Office 4,000 jobs in Croydon. I'm sure Kingston and Sutton will be wanting big companies to move out. So there's that possibly to think about.
And then there's the working practice that many, when they're moving out, are going to hot desking and encouraging employees to work at home several days a week.
David, what's the business take on that?
Well, I think on the transport demand, we're facing much more uncertainty than we have done in recent years, and that's a fact we're sort of grappling with. I've not seen sort of any comprehensive or clear evidence or analysis. I think people are still trying to get their heads around this, but I think there is no doubt that both Transport for London on their network and the commuter rail services coming into London have both reported some dips in demand from a mix of reasons. You know, partly it is some changes in work patterns maybe. It could be a bit of a dip in economic activity. It could be, you know, tourists and visitors outside of London being a bit more nervous at coming into London in response to some of the, you know, challenges that we've seen over the past year or two. Internet shopping, as you say, there are a number of factors at play here. And we do need to sort of get to the bottom of them more. They seem to be experienced more on the commuter rail network than on the TfL network, as far as I can tell, particularly the TfL peaks. You know, it's not obvious to me that we've seen some radical changes in the, you know, in peak travel activity on the core TfL network. You know, it is clearly still the case that there are, you know, in that morning peak, which can be for quite a period in London, you know, try getting off, you know, a train at one of the big London terminuses and getting onto the tube network. You know, there is very real congestion there now, let alone in 5 years, 10 years. Bits of the tube network, you know, try getting on a train south of Stockwell in the morning peak on the Northern Line. You won't. They're full, those trains. And similarly in outer London, you know, the sort of the patchiness of some of the services means that some of those are very full. So I think there's a sort of an asymmetry here. You know, you know, it is the case that, you know, there is more uncertainty there. My fear is how we react to that uncertainty. You know, it will be, you know, we will have siren voices upstream from our friends in the Treasury and the Department for Transport saying, well, let's just sit tight and see what pans out. Let's not make, you know, big plans. It might be that demand doesn't go up and we should just sit tight and see what pans out. Whereas, you know, the fact of London at the moment is we are, you know, experiencing some real capacity and crowding problems now. You know, the signs are that they are likely to get worse, and I'm much more worried about an absence of capacity in the future than I am about building some infrastructure that will be underutilised. I mean, we don't really have much experience of that in the past 50 years. It's not a fear that is high on my list.
And lastly, I mean, the point is a good one about the capacity issues. Those people that are trying to get on the tube or on the train at the moment, if they heard that there may be a rise of 50% over 20 years, they would be horrified because they can't get on it at the moment. So what we've heard here is that the modelling and the forecasting is at best a bit foggy, and it needs to get better. Chair.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed for that. We're going to move on to planning for London's future rail needs. And Florence, you're going to lead this section.
Yeah, no, you've all touched on it essentially in terms of the infrastructure and how we look at dealing with the capacity and population rise in London. And also you touched on some of the improvements that we need at certain stations. I've lived in Brixton all my life, and the only place I don't feel safe is Brixton rail station. I would not encourage anyone to use that station at night because it's just so dark, dingy, and it needs such a major uplift. And I think about my journey on the railways and the tube prior to having children, whereas now I've got children, I have to meticulously plan out my route in terms of looking at stations that are accessible. And my whole day could change if I turn up at a station and guess what, the lifts are out of order, so it makes a big difference. And then you talk about residents in London with disability issues. So in terms of that infrastructure and the challenges, what key things do you feel that we need that would benefit Londoners the most? I'll start with you, David.
Well, I think there's two things. There is absolutely the infrastructure, but actually following on from the previous point, I think there is also the sort of, and it came up a bit in the discussion area, there is also the sort of the fares and ticketing side of things. I mean, there clearly are some changes in the structure of demand. You know, more people are working part-time, more people are working flexibly from home at least one day a week, typically a Friday, so it's quite lumpy. You know, London and TfL have been world leaders in terms of things like contactless. Actually, I don't think we have seen that same sort of spirit of innovation and creativity about the sorts of tickets that we sell to people, the sorts of fare structure. So actually, I think that is one area over the next 10 years or so that there is scope for more innovation and a bit of creativity, actually, to think about how the products that Transport for London is offering can match better the reality of Londoners' day-to-day lives. On the infrastructure side, we clearly are going to need some more of it. I think the Mayor's transport strategy, is a good strategy. It's a good long-term vision. It's identified, all of the things that I would hope to see in it and the various upgrades. There is no shortage of good plans. There are some absolutely critical improvements to existing infrastructure. I put the tube modernisation programme very high at the list. That continuing is absolutely critical. And if there are any signs that things like the Piccadilly line were being delayed or put back further, that would be a very real cause for alarm for us. That would be a sort of a red flashing light. Beyond that, we clearly do need to keep planning for some new bits of infrastructure. We have been very vigorous in making the case for Crossrail 2. That does stand out to us as, in terms of the major new priority infrastructure requirement for London and the South East in the 2020s. That to us stands out head and shoulders above it as a very good project that would add significant capacity. The big challenge is one of paying for it and affordability. And, that is something that we are all grappling with. And part of the fact that we're going to have to confront on that, I think, is that if in London and the South East we want to keep investing in our network, and that we accept the needs for investment across the wider UK as well, which I think we have to. There is a very real need out there to invest in things like the Northern Powerhouse Rail. Then we are going to have to contribute ourselves. That's the message coming back from the Treasury and the DfT. It's not a wholly welcome one. My members in the business community would rather not pay additionally for better infrastructure, but if that's part of the deal, we've shown with the Crossrail funding package, through business rates, through developer contributions and the mayoral seal, that will be part of the deal. And I think looking forward, that will have to continue to be part of the deal in future, both for the sort of, I guess, the members I represent, but also I suspect for some of the people you represent, whether through the fares they pay or through things like council tax. This is going to be difficult, but I think we have to accept that if we want continued investment, Londoners and London businesses are going to have to help do their bit.
No, that's good. Is there anything you wanted to add on to that, Stephen?
I think it would be easy to answer this question in talking about more infrastructure, and there's definitely, and David is right, we need more infrastructure, but I think the points you made about the quality of service equally deserve planning for the reasons that Helena said about the changing nature of London's population and ageing population. So I think I'd suggest two things really. Firstly, metroisation, which we've talked about before, means that you're investing in interchanges. So that I think if TfL had the South London rail network, one of the things they wanted to do was to put an interchange at Streatham, so as you'd be able to run frequent trains into the mainland stations rather than 4 trains an hour or something, compared with 36 on the Victoria line. So it's all very well Network Rail talking about digital railways and the technology that goes with that, but metroisation is the only way in which you're really going to take advantage of that technology coming forward. Absolutely. So interchanges and joining up the system. And then I think it's about investment in accessibility and staffing and support, so that actually you have visible staffing at Brixton and other mainline stations, accessibility, the Access for All Fund, which TfL has managed to get bits of from national government, feels quite sort of, it's a bit like kind of grabbing bits of money as it passes, rather than looking at the London Rail network and working out where the places that really need accessibility improvements can be done. But Denmark Hill, which is next to King's College Hospital, has has shown that you can take an old Victorian standard suburban railway station and make it accessible. And some of the London Overground stations, like West Hampstead on the Overground, are starting to do that too. So I think it's easy to think about the big ticket Crossrail 2. I'm not criticising David, I'm just saying that alongside that we need to think about the other things that are for planning for the future.
And I'd agree entirely with that proposition. The need for the heavy infrastructure is absolutely there. The fact is that there's a substantial number of stations in our sub-region and across London which are completely inaccessible for significant proportions of the population, whether they be elderly or whether they have a disability, or whether because they're afraid of going there. And that can't be something that we can ignore. And that doesn't need complicated financing mechanisms and mayoral sills. It needs attention to the basics. And that is absolutely the case. For example, in the Thameslink loop, which goes through Merton and Sutton, all of the stations on that loop are completely inaccessible to people with disabilities. They're all dependent on stairs. And that is absolutely more than a necessary requirement for us to think about investing in that. That's unacceptable. And we need to make sure that we're putting in place the infrastructure to allow everyone to use the transport network. The other more... another issue which also from the Assembly members' position in terms of the safety issue, in Sutton at the moment we're undertaking as a part of our digital strategy a programme called Smart Place, which is looking at ways in which we can solve knotty problems about managing urban spaces. One of those is about access and accessibility for people with profound learning disabilities who require independent travel. So thinking about how we can apply digital mechanisms to enable accessibility to the transport network and ensure those are safe is a part of that challenge. So thinking more not only about the heavy infrastructure but also the supporting mechanisms about information, safety, supervision, which we can think about using alternative digital strategies to achieve. So we have huge opportunities in London with the 5G network. The NNDR, the devolution arrangements we've got, the sub-region has submitted, for example, for our bid to that fund, the establishment of a local area network which is 5G enabled, to enable that real-time information which enables you and others to make those choices about where to go, how to use that infrastructure, how to use what we've got at the moment more smartly and make those smart choices. And that doesn't require huge amounts of capital investment. It requires a lateral thinking about what the problem looks like.
And I appreciate that you may not have studied it inside out, but Network Rail run their cycles in 5 years with the control period plans. And the current one, the control period 6, runs from 2019 to 2024. Whereas you look at the Mayor's transport strategy, which it covers a much longer time span of up to 2041. To what extent do you feel that some of the things you've just touched on is captured in the current Network Rail cycle control plan?
Well, not at all. It's a short answer. And this is a general problem. It isn't just London that faces that, because all the city regions have or are developing those kinds of long-term plans. And if you went to talk to the Mayor of Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority, he would talk about the challenge of growth and development, looking a long way out and trying to get a view about rail development. The Lee Valley line issues, London Stansted Corridor, is very strongly relates to that. I mean, I think there is a very strong case for much longer term planning in these areas. But you know, the current, if anything, the problem we've got is that the current control period it seems to be shortening rather than lengthening with some of the problems that the National Railway is facing, and subject to ever more intense short-term political interference, particularly on enhancements, where there is the enhancement funding is now directly under the control of the Department of Transport for the next control period. It's unclear how that's going to be spent. There isn't a clarity on that at the moment, and what, you know, if anything, London gets out of that, and that is a real concern.
Helena, was there anything you wanted to add, specifically in terms of Network Rail's plans and maybe looking at the range of policies and ideas outlined in the Mayor's transport strategy?
Nothing particularly on the National Rail plans. In terms of the Mayor's transport strategy, I think I want to sort of reiterate sort of what my colleagues said around looking at sort of the smaller stations and the sort of quality of those smaller stations, ensuring that service quality staffing at stations is part of that consideration, and then finally sort of thinking more about information provision to passengers and how that's done, and what sort of information through what mechanisms suits them best. Thinking of the whole variety of passengers, from the regular commuters to the more occasional users of the rail system who are perhaps less confident travellers. And using your own example there, if you'd known in advance to check that morning and you'd seen the lifts were out, it might have saved you a
Times you check,
lot of
when
trouble.
you turn up, it's a totally different story.
Yes, so
The
I
real
mean,
time.
absolutely, information's not valuable if it's not accurate.
Yeah, no.
Can I just pick up, you know, in the Mayor's final transport strategy, he really had beefed up the section on things like the West London orbital line. Maybe David, is that a reality? Is it deliverable? We've got other really exciting projects, Crossrail 2, Bakerloo line extension, things that we all have looked at and generally support, but is it realistic? Is it going to be delivered?
I mean, there is a great list, there are a great range of projects and a great list of projects, all of which have, you know, I'm sure have a positive business case and would make a significant positive difference. You know, the reality we face is that in the very near term, at least, they are not going to be affordable and deliverable. Now, over you know, the Mayor's transport strategy is, of course, quite a long look over a long horizon, but it's you know, over a 20-year period, maybe it is more plausible. But I'm afraid we're simply not going to be able to advance on all fronts in the next 2 years, the next 5 years. And, you know, we are going to have to make some slightly uncomfortable choices about prioritisation.
Are you hopeful we might make progress on having looked at the whole strategy and with your expertise in this area?
I think there is the critical progress on some of the, you know, sort of, I hesitate to call it business as usual because it's more than that, I guess, elevated business as usual, like the tube modernisation programme. I'm confident that that will continue. Beyond that, I guess, on the big enhancements, we have, you know, a range of options which are being developed further, which I think is the right thing to do. You know, there are good options around, you know, the Bakerloo line extension, extending the DLR to Thamesmead, say, extending Crossrail East. The West London one I know less well, to be perfectly honest, but you know, partly that will depend on, you know, the interrelationship with housing. You know, where there is a boost to housing, these things will be more attractive. It's a bit of a challenge because inevitably it takes time for that housing to come through. So, you know, there is a great desire to see more housing now, next year, the year after. These big transport schemes, you know, they will have an impact that is further out than that. You know, I continue to be a very strong champion for Crossrail 2, not because I think it is the only thing that matters. I certainly don't think that, but I do think that we have seen before that with those, you know, they are a big ask, these projects, but they're also a big prize. And I think we did see with Crossrail 1. You know, we had a long discussion in London, was, you know, trying to push for a big prize like that. Did that risk, you know, compromising the tube modernisation programme and some other things? Actually, we managed to make progress on both. So I think there is a premium on ambition. I don't think we should stop being ambitious and being demanding and pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But over the next year or two, you know, I think we are pushing to, let's see what we can, you know, what commitments and promises we can extract from the government, particularly around the budget this year. And then we are looking at entering into a sort of spending review territory next year, at which some of these debates are going to have to be had. And I think, you know, as a city, we are going to have to think about our asks and choosing there. You know, if we're asking for 20 things, we might be heard slightly less favourably than if we've got some, you know, 3 priorities, say.
If you want to come in.
David, just others might want to comment just on HS2. If it happens, do we think that will have an impact on London's rail service?
Well, I think sort of HS2, as we stand at the moment, seems to be one of those things that is absolutely baked into the government's plans for the next couple of decades. So that seems to be one of the, you know, firm constants out there. It clearly will have an impact in particular places. I mean, it will have a very real impact at Euston Station and at Old Oak, where it interfaces with the London network. At Euston, the impact it will have is to bring more people into Euston Station, a station that is already struggling to cope with the volumes of people it has. What we will see at Euston Station, unless we do something different, is that in the, you know, in the peak hours, it will close. You know, that interface between, you know, you will be stood on the concourse waiting to get entrance into the tube station, unless we do something radical. You know, the plans that is part of the justification for the interchange with Crossrail 2 there. But, you know, HS2 is happening. You know, 2026, I think it is, that the first stage to Birmingham. That will be additional people coming into what is already a congested station. 2033, the full Y. You know, we are going to see some very real problems at Euston by then, unless we have some plans to alleviate those.
Else want to comment on that?
Okay. No. I've got Tom and then Caroline.
So let's say we get Crossrail 2 funded, fantastic. What's next? Do we need Crossrail 3? Do we need to be thinking about where that goes, or do we need to be prioritising investment in other infrastructures? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I just reiterate the point that it's less glamorous, but metroising the South London rail network
That
would be the thing, because
Absolutely.
it does involve some investment. Actually, I think things like the Streatham interchange, you could look for funding from developers. You could see that happening. So making much better use of what is quite an intensive rail network in London feels like the big priority, and it is less glamorous than Crossrail 3 or wherever that would be, but it is the thing that's most important. And then the things we've talked about around accessibility and so on, in terms of making the system more usable, feel like, you know, that these are collectively big ticket items, but actually they do make a big difference, providing, yeah, to the colleague who's not there at the moment, you know, orbital bus links across South London linking into the rail network. You know, these are things that would make a big difference, and I think it's easy to just focus on the big projects without looking at those things.
So I couldn't agree more. We've got to think about Crossrail 2's development horizon. It's not going to be in the next decades. It wouldn't even be built. In the meantime, we have the projections coming from the Mayor in terms of the population growth, which we've already identified, and the remedial requirement for infrastructure improvement. The original agreement, which was signed by Patrick McLaughlin and the previous Mayor, envisaged that South London metronisation would be broadly cost neutral in the context of being able to achieve the investment requirement. That could be done now. And the opportunity exists in terms of the refranchising arrangements that are coming forward quite quickly. We've lost it for South West trains, but ultimately, for the South London franchises, it could be done now. And in addition to which, I would argue or contend the current performance of that franchise would merit some intervention from the Secretary of State to bring that date earlier. And that could then, as a consequence, quite easily, says he, quite easily allocated to the Mayor for responsibility for implementing it now. That would make a considerable improvement in the quality of life of residents in South London, would enable confidence for the development industry to invest, to allow us then to make progress in relation to our economic ambitions, and probably the quantum of development expected for Crossrail 2 in South London, probably half of it would be developed as a consequence of more reliability in the existing infrastructure.
Well, I think it's frustrating to all of us here that Chris Grayling reneged on that agreement. And actually probably the next suburban rail line to be devolved won't be in South London at all. It will be another line in North London. Not that we're opposed to that at all.
Exactly. If I may make one slightly I'm thinking about how to put this. It's even more egregious given the fact that Chris Grayling's constituency about Sutton and Kingston and the transport infrastructure of his own residents has been impacted because the termination for a terminus for a lot of these routes that come through South London are in Epsom, they're in Ewell, those areas. And so the residents in those parts of the close neighbours in Surrey are desperate for this change to happen equally. And we know that from our own analysis in relation to their input and our work with our neighbouring authorities in Surrey and East Sussex and West Sussex.
I do think there's an opportunity for TfL and the Mayor to work with the other mayors and combined authorities and subnational transport bodies to make this argument. So Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands, is the centre of something called West Midlands Rail, which would be like TfL and the surrounding counties getting together. So West Midlands Rail runs from Hereford to Crewe, actually, but obviously the Birmingham network at the centre of it. And Andy Street has made no secret of the fact that he wants much more control over that network than he currently has under the new franchise. And so I think there are opportunities for networking with Wales and Scotland and with the North of England and others to talk about, to put pressure on central government to hand over control over a lot of the local rail network to local bodies.
Might be the way to secure it, being not just about London.
Mm.
Just always the
Absolutely.
I've seen Caroline, Joanne, and then David's coming in.
Yes, just picking up on something that Stephen said earlier about the importance of thinking about healthy streets and tackling problems like air pollution in relation to rail. And also thinking about a lot of what's been discussed so far has been about getting people from outer London into the centre. On the Economy Committee here on the Assembly, we've actually been looking at how the Mayor's culture strategy has actually been helping to develop local economies in outer London. So we're actually talking also about getting people to outer London. And I just wonder whether anyone, particularly possibly Helena as well, with the ideas of sort of ageing populations and people living their lives differently in terms of their working practices, just if people could expand a bit more on the importance of our rail stations being properly connected into the local areas, so that to help reduce the car dependence. Because if when you get to the place you're going, the only way you can get anywhere is by car, or you feel like that because the roads are so hostile and unpleasant, that slightly undermines the networking that the rails can provide.
I think you're quite right. It does make a big difference. Coming to mind in terms of sort of things like local economies is the sort of things like the culture area that's being developed at Wealdstone, which is meant to be sort of attracting people outwards to that area as a new sort of employment area, and all sorts of sort of local facilities, not forgetting sort of where our hospitals are, where the Crown Courts are, that attract people from across London, sort of in terms of lawyers, friends, family, as well as patients for longer journeys, who will be looking to use the rail system to get there. So it's incredibly important we think about sort of this complexity of flows. I don't think we understand enough about them yet, and how they're going to change, because we don't quite know enough about sort of how working practices and where will truly grow and what won't. But we certainly need to do more to think about how we integrate those into the rail system, and whether that's better bus interchanges around railway stations, thinking about changing on how we sort of balance the rail system so that it's as attractive to travel outwards as it is to travel inwards.
Certainly the experience of turning up at an outer London rail station, unless you've got City Mapper and your phone is properly charged up,
Yes.
you can feel like there's maybe no staff at the station. There's no kind of sense of how you connect then into the area that you're going to.
Multiple exits with no indication as even which one is the right one for you. Yes.
Indeed.
I mentioned earlier the idea of fixing the link, seeing stations as transport hubs or gateways to surrounding communities, and I think actually a practical suggestion the committee might make would be for TfL to take one of the overground stations that it now controls, and possibly some of the Crossrail stations in outer London, and actually do some, take one or two of them and do a practical investment in those just to see how healthy streets as a philosophy could be applied to those outer London stations, and just show what can be done, much in the way the Mini Hollands did on cycling and walking out in London, to do something practical. I suspect there'd be a queue of boroughs wanting to work with TfL on.
Niall's already sitting in the queue.
But that feels like something that would practically take that forward. I just wanted to come back to the West London Orbital. I think there are opportunities there actually, because some of that is about using freight and other underused lines. I think I mentioned it when I last came to the committee about the concept of workplace parking levy, but in the Hounslow have raised that as one option for paying for the reintroduction of passenger services on the freight line from Southall to Brentford. And I think there's some willingness among the business community around the Golden Mile of Brentford to pay and to consider something like that, because, as David said, no business is like paying more for things, but if they can see tangible benefits from something like that, that feels like a solution for that area, which is very car dependent. There's very little that the public transport there isn't brilliant. That actually providing a link, that link into Crossrail, in fact, at Southall, feels like something that could happen, and with a workplace parking levy as piloted in Nottingham, could be something that would make a difference. So I think it would be useful for TfL to work with Hounslow and the other boroughs talking about the West London Metro to see whether something like that levy might work.
And presumably also the buses that, well, whether Oxford Street buses are still going to be heading towards outer London, but thinking about if there's extra bus capacity to make sure that it connects with these stations so that they become more usable.
Okay, I think Joanne next.
Yeah, it was purely because the issue of devolution has come up now rather than later. Of course, I accept the case for South London, but also, as Niall particularly will know, there's parts of North London that are barons as far as tube networks are concerned. And, for example, the Great Northern Line franchises up in 2021. We had the GIB report last year that recommended devolution to TfL. And I was just going to ask Stephen, really, you talked about if services are devolved, they are more accountable, more locally focused, and a better quality of service. And you talked about planning that as well. Have you seen benefits of that happening, particularly with outer London boroughs?
I mean, it's 5 years old now, the report, but we did do a report that looked at London Overground and Merseyrail and compared and contrasted what happened before those services were devolved in terms of the quality of service, frequency, investment, stations, with what's happened since. And I think there's a myth around about London Overground. Well, you know, that was great because they got lots of investment. Actually, for the first few years, they didn't get lots of investment, and their performance and punctuality went up because the way the contract said incentivises the operator to do the thing, control the things the operator can do, which is to get the trains out, to manage the stations properly, it takes away some of the issues around revenue and so on that bedevil some of the wider arguments. And I just think that you know that this has shown to work. It's worked elsewhere, and I think that there's a very strong case for devolving the Great Northern Services, as the Gibb report recognised. And then I think there's a discussion to be had about actually within the future GTR, what's now the GTR franchise, what happens to South London as well. So, I mean, we're strong supporters of this, and on an evidence base that actually, on the whole, devolved rail works. And as I said, Merseyrail has had no investment. It's got some of the oldest trains in the entire country. It still does well, it's now looking at ordering a new fleet of trains which will maintain staffing as trains for the last station. They will be genuinely accessible on what is partly as old a network as some of the London Rail network is. So my point is that devolution works, and there are opportunities for TfL and other authorities to learn from each other.
Wonderful. And Chevrolet's are aware the Mayor is on his way to Liverpool today to meet the other regional mayors, and so I like the idea that that should be one of their future agenda.
So I think we might want to suggest that. Lovely, thank you. David, do you want to bring up some areas?
Thanks. Yeah, if I could ask you, Stephen, about the digital railway, which we've all talked a bit about so far, and you mentioned the Jubilee line, which is fantastic now because there's 36 trains an hour in the peak. But this sort of digital railway programme idea of upgrading the signalling and so on, which has happened in some of those lines on the underground, do you think it's possible that can happen all over or the whole rail network? Can it be implemented, and what would its effects be?
Well, I'm not a technology specialist, but I mean, hidden by the mess that has been the Thameslink timetable has been the fact that actually they have made the digital railway, automatic train operation work on that central core for the first time on any mainline railway anywhere in Europe. So actually, all credit to Network Rail for that. They have shown that they can make it work on a mainline railway. I think the key to digital railway, if you're going to see Network Rail in a few weeks, then you can ask them, is to work out what the benefits, to turn this into a program that actually brings, real benefits for users and operators on the rail and communities around the rail network in terms of more frequency, more reliability, and something that's genuinely more usable. And I think there will be, that is what the technology promises, because it removes a lot of the signalling and as has happened on the underground lines. And it is worth mentioning the person in charge now at Network Rail of the digital railway was responsible for the digital railway for the Jubilee and Victoria and Northern Line changes. So
speak
he
up a
doesn't
little
know what
bit,
he's talking
Stephen.
about.
I'm struggling to hear you there. Could you speak slightly
Sorry.
more to the mic? That's right.
Sorry, I was...
Just missed that last
yes,
bit.
I was just saying that the person responsible now, David Waboso at Network Rail for the digital railway, it was the person at London Underground responsible for that, so he does know what he's talking about. I think the question is whether he's got the team around him to make this work, and whether Network Rail can turn this from a slogan into something that has meaningful benefits across the network in terms of frequency and reliability and in speed.
And I think the line to ask Network Rail about very explicitly would be the Brighton Main Line. That seems to be the one that is in the frame at the top of the list for potential sort of upgrades through the digital railway approach. And as Stephen says, the critical thing is to put some flesh on the bones of this, really. You know, there is no doubt that that is a section of the commuter rail network into London that is going to need some significant sort of enhancements over the next decade or so. You know, there is a considerable amount of uncertainty about where Network Rail will be investing in upgrades and enhancements over the 2020s. And, you know, this strikes me as one of those that it would be good to get some clarity and commitment to.
Just one other thing, slightly different. We've mentioned infrastructure, signalling, metroisation. But are there any other things that we may have missed that you think would be good improvements to the rail network that we haven't mentioned yet? If not, don't worry.
I think we've gone down the list.
Touched on fares as well, haven't we?
Exactly.
I would suggest the committee might want to think about the shape of the ask, if you will, or the recommendations in the short, medium and longer term.
That's a good point.
Because the infrastructure interventions that are required aren't always the heavy lifting gear. Some of them are quite simple. Some of them are about attitudes and prioritisation within existing resources rather than new resources. Asking Network Rail about that would be very helpful. I think this also talks to John McCartney's point about policy integration. You know, we should be aiming to get the economic benefit and the access benefits and the cultural benefits and implementing safe streets and good growth. That should be a part of the single package of intervention. I think one of the things which happens with transport infrastructure is seen as transport infrastructure, and the capital is deployed for that purpose. It has to have a broader impact across multiple policy objectives for it to be really successful, and that's entirely achievable. And Network Rail, in my experience, tends to just see it simply as a package of interventions within their estate, rather than the broader impact across the communities they serve.
Could I just ask David, in terms of digital railway, is there anywhere else in the world where they're doing this and we should be looking to as sort of a good practice? You can always write to us afterwards if you want to have a think about it. I just think, you know, we're not, there are other places that have got great railway systems where it's really tried and tested. Maybe you could put your thinking hat on.
Interestingly, this was one of the ones that, you know, New York is looking to London to copy the experience of the modernisation
on the
programme.
tube, yes.
On the tube in
yes.
particular.
But,
you know, we
outdoor
forget
rail,
we've done
you
it.
know, the rail networks, is there anywhere else leading the
reflect
way
on
on
that.
this? Brilliant, thank you. Let's look at a rail strategy for London. Joanne.
So I think the question is, will there ever be a common one that everyone agrees on? But what's clear is it's so complex and so many players involved in delivering rail services in London. And I was very struck by what Stephen said earlier, and I wrote it down, that you said the join-up between transport and planning, that at government it's been traditionally bad. And I'm just wondering, what do we need to do to make sure that government, Network Rail, operators, TfL, and everyone really works together to develop that strategic infrastructure, rail infrastructure for London?
You could look to what Scotland's got. They've got an alliance in which the person running the ScotRail trains is in fact also running the Network Rail zone up there. And what Scotland's done, and the Scottish Government's done with that, within the ScotRail franchise, has been to look at major developments around the Scottish Rail stations, so that there is a commitment. For example, I think it's Dundee, where there's a big station development which is turning the station around, looking outwards and so on. And so they've been able, so that they've used the alliance between the train operator and Network Rail to to move towards the wider benefits that Niall was talking about earlier. So I think that would be a practical way forward. Again, looking for practicalities as opposed to big statements that people sign up to. Actually doing the kind of partnerships, some experimental partnerships around some stations. Network keeps saying they want lots of third-party funding. Well, maybe TfL and the Mayor can say to Network Rail, and after all, its chair, he's had some association with London in the past, let's try something in London. Let's do some experiments around some stations to show how a partnership can work. And again, West Midlands is doing that. They've got a station partnership. Greater Manchester talked about a stations partnership. Chris Grayling told them they couldn't have one, so they're going back and looking at it again. So there are things you can learn from that TfL, I know it does talk to these other authorities, can do to make something happen. So this is about, it isn't just having a shared aim at a big pan-London level of what should happen to rail across the piece. It's about making that work on the ground in the way that Niall's been talking about, to make joint development happen. Elsewhere, there have been initiatives. I think Homes England is doing work with Network Rail on some stations at places like York and Taunton to use land around the stations and bring it back into use. So maybe, given that there has been that join up there, there's an opportunity to bring in Homes England as a sort of enabler of some of those wider developments that people want to see happen.
We need a London Rail Board.
Well, Centre for London talked about creating Rail South, which was, as Niall has said, the South London boroughs with, Kent, Surrey, Sussex, Western East Sussex, and so on. And I think there's an opportunity to think about that. As I've said, West Midlands Rail exists, Rail North, Transport for the North exists as joint groupings of local authorities with some control over their local rail network, not as much as they want. So that, there are bodies in place that look like that. And as I said, Hertfordshire, I think, proposed such a board at one point. So I think there would be an opportunity for talking to the surrounding authorities. Sounds like Niall's grouping already is doing that, to see what the opportunities are for making something practical happen.
Your next question. Could I just welcome Manor Longbridge School from Barking and Dagenham. We're very welcome at City Hall today. This is the Transport Committee, and we're looking at the train services in London, how we can make them better going forward and make sure there's enough trains to carry people around the city. Back to you, Joanne.
So I think what I've gathered today is that I don't think anybody thinks that at the moment we plan our rail services to tie up appropriately with where we need employment, where we need housing, and those other strategy imperatives. So if we had this board or grouping or partnership, what other powers or what ability would they need? Because we've heard about, the data they collect and how they plan, and I think it was Stephen or David talked about how you plan trains, but it seems to be irrespective of what's happening with regards to those other priorities. So what else would need to happen? No, yeah.
So what I'm really pleased with, we referring to the Centre for London report, which looked at, and that's becoming a reality now, with the draft sub-national transport strategy, which was just published by the Transport for the South East Board, in terms of looking at the integration of all transport mechanisms. So that such a rail board would also have to be thinking about other means of accessibility and mobility. So it would be about integrated seamless services. Part of the concern, for example, in South London is having the complex network that we have. The interchange issues can be as much of a frustration as the trains themselves, because you're depending on the reliability of unreliable networks. So as a consequence of that, a transport board, for example, or a rail board for South London and the Greater South East could look at that integration and look at planning more effectively, which prioritises the needs of the urban requirements for transport as well as the intra-urban requirements, because that doesn't happen at the moment. A lot of capacity in South London is occupied by people commuting from outside London and therefore occupying the space that is available at the moment. The board could look at far more integrated transport planning, but also integrated ticketing to enable that to happen. The other thing which I think it would be also incredibly important to do is have to identify the prioritisation for infrastructure, because there's a clamour for a lot of infrastructure investment, but actually there needs to be some prioritisation. I echo my colleague who said, you know, going to government and saying you've got 20 priorities, you're not going to get any of them. So basically we need to have a mature debate in a properly democratically accountable body which enables those trade-offs to be heard and decisions to be made about what comes first. And I think that board will be absolutely essential. Our own conversations with our colleagues in the Subnational Transport Board for the South East is beginning to talk about that. And beginning to think about what the functional economic areas we share are in order that we can make those priority investments. So, for example, the Brighton Main Line is absolutely pivotal to the functioning of the Gatwick Diamond, absolutely pivotal to the infrastructure requirement for South London and to optimise metroisation. That is absolutely necessary in order that we can get better accessibility. That Transport Board could lobby and seek the investment requirement to make that happen.
Obviously, this is more of a formal structure than it exists at the moment. Has there been any indication from the Department of Transport that they would welcome such organisation?
My view is, the structure does exist, and we shouldn't be asking for permission. We should be working collaboratively to do it.
Question.
And,
yes.
And we should just get on with it. And doing that is absolutely, getting that coalition, which is already primed, because if you do read the draft strategy for the South East for transport, it really does echo and chime with the Mayor's own transport strategy. The synergies are already there. It needs politically joining up.
Thank you. I'd seen Sean next and then Tom.
Maybe to address this to Niall and Stephen and David to some extent. I just want to investigate the theme that my colleague Joanne brought up here about this sub-regional, transport board or rail board. What are the bars to making it happen? If you're saying that the mechanisms are there, why doesn't it exist, at least informally? What are the bars?
The mechanism is only recently there, with the establishment of the subnational transport boards. And that is important, and working with our colleagues in the Greater South East to enable that to be its function. In effect, it's a prototype moving towards a Transport for London-like structure, but it isn't there at the moment. It's got strategic responsibilities rather than delivery responsibilities at the moment. So we, as I said, rather than asking for permission, we need to use what we've got to come forward with a plan of action to get the coalition of the political interests, because the political interests are really diverse. They represent all of the political interests. And the need is identified and clear to absolutely ask and demand for devolution and require it to happen to make sure the economic powerhouse, which is our region and that wider region around us, can absolutely drive the economy of the UK. And that's essentially what this is all about. Getting that optimised transport infrastructure is critical to the UK's future, particularly in the context of post-Brexit world. Because we can't have sub-optimised infrastructure which is not enabling people to realise their ambitions and the economic potential of our regions.
I'd just make one comment about this. We've been Transport for the North is already a subnational transport body which has statutory status, and in a way what Transport for the South East wants to do is to move in that direction towards a statutory status. I just make one comment. I think there's a note of caution really. I think it's important that in creating these big subnational bodies that accountability and transparency isn't left behind. there's a bit of a tendency for groupthink to appear and for people just to talk to each other, where we've done some work for Transport for the North actually in terms of engaging the wider community, the wider stakeholders, which I think they found very valuable because I think they got insights over what people thought was important they wouldn't otherwise have got. And I think it's very important that in the context of what we're talking about here, that rail users of all sorts and people who might be rail users but aren't at the moment because they find it very difficult to use the system, feel that their voice is being heard on a London Regional Rail Board or some such body, so that it doesn't feel out of touch. And we've got enough of that with the Department for Transport managing rail franchises. I think we need to make sure that anything that replaces it has talks to the wider world.
If you indulge me just a while shorter, is it obvious then which bodies should be on this body and who should overlook that body? Because it's in a certain extent the big players are obvious, but your comment leads me to believe that there may be other bodies who it's not obvious straight away should be involved for transparency reasons, just for reach, so that all of the decisions, planning, etc., are in that room.
Well, my view is that it has to be democratically accountable. It would be because of what I do, and therefore it has to be representative of the communities it serves. And it has to therefore, whether it be representatives from the Mayor and Transport for London and the Assembly, it also has to engage the boroughs, the counties, the districts. And I also echo the point about the interest groups in terms of the users. There must be a mechanism for engaging across the piece, that collaboration, so that there's accountability in real time as well as in periodic time. When people go to the ballot box, there has to be a continuous process of being completely transparent. And I think that's really important because of the previous point I made about, that we can't do everything. Someone's going to have to wait. Yes. And when people have to wait for stuff, they need to know why they're waiting and what the priority is. And we've got a transparency obligation and a duty to explain it. At the moment, part of the problem is nobody understands why Network Rail makes any of the decisions they do unless they're really technically enabled. That's really important in terms of enabling communities to understand the dilemmas and the trade-offs in terms of investment within the limited resources we've got.
Has anybody done the work at looking at the membership of our equivalent body, or is it just a case of copying what's happening in the West Midlands and in the North?
It's early. It's just starting. The discussions are starting now. But it's a good idea and it needs airing and debating.
I think that the Centre for London work, turning South London orange, was a good start in this direction.
Did build on some work we had done on the Assembly, I should add. Tom?
I was just to say, I mean, for everything that's been said, it sounds like one of the major problems over the years has been fragmentation of the railways, and actually for many years the prevailing wisdom, not just in this country, but also actually something that the European Union has been pushing, has been the separation of operation from infrastructure. Are you saying that really we need to be sort of going the other way now and looking much more at how we can integrate people who operate the trains with the people who are running the track?
I'm saying that you do need to do, that there does need to be better integration. There was a Southwest Trains Alliance which didn't work well. But as I say, Scotland does seem to have made it work, and I'm suggesting that there might be some learning from that, not least because of what the Scottish Government seems to have done in terms of joining up the railways to the wider objectives that the Scottish Government have. And indeed, in their case, reopening the rail lines at the borders, which missed every cost-benefit analysis going, but has still been enormously successful.
There's also a bit of an accountability issue. I mean, whenever something goes wrong, like with Thameslink or something like that, train operators blame Network Rail, Network Rail blames train operators. At least on London Underground, they come in here and one person sits there and they can't really blame anybody else because they run the trains and they maintain the track.
I think it's possible. All I'm saying is I think it's possible to create a more accountable and better joined up railway without going for complete and full integration. It's possible to do that. There are plenty of models around.
I think you're thinking about it in exactly the right sort of way. I think, interestingly, I mean, in terms of the strategy, I think we've actually got a pretty good strategy in London. I think it's pretty clear who's accountable for what. I think the biggest challenges and weaknesses and failings actually are as we get further away. And, over the past year, where we've seen the biggest problems have been at the centre, to be perfectly honest. The lack of clarity about precisely who is coordinating and planning and leading. The problems on Thameslink and Northern Rail have been, failures of accountability, failures of planning, failures of coordination, and a lot of those go right back to the centre, to be perfectly honest. Actually, part of the, I endorse what others have said about part of the answer being a bit of localisation. Actually, from a business perspective, we have also supported that. The MTS identifies specific services, and I think that's the right way of thinking of it, not in the big broad brush ideological terms, but identifying those suburban services that actually it would make a real difference and would be possible. I think we're on to something now, and I think it's reassuring that that's more what I think the Mayor and TfL are talking about now, specific things. I don't hear the Mayor talking about taking over Thameslink as much now, which I think must be a tremendous relief to Mike Brown. Be careful what you wish for on those things.
Yes.
But I think that's where the biggest challenges are.
They'd need to break up the service, wouldn't they?
They would.
If the Mayor
They
would
would,
take
but
over. They'd be part of it, but yes.
But I think it is that accountability, and I think that's the right way of thinking of it, rather than necessarily the ownership, which is where a lot of the public debate goes to. The idea that what we need right now is more central and DFT control over everything. I think is the wrong way of thinking about it. Actually, it's the accountability that is the critical thing.
Well, interestingly, someone's dug up a transcript from 3 years ago when Peter Hendy was the TfL commissioner, sat here in front of us saying that he never thought Thameslink was going to work because it was too complicated. You can't put that many trains to that many destinations through central London.
Over-optimism, groupthink, and fear of reporting the truth upwards and centrally. That's what seems to have happened.
Yes.
And we've seen that with Network Rail and other projects like the Barking to Gospel Oak electrification, just not admitting that they were behind and things hadn't happened, even though you could see it. It's obviously a culture there. Let's move on to look at funding now, which has come up throughout. Tom.
And well, David, I think you I'm sure London First have some views on this one in particular. I mean, something I'm very interested in is funding infrastructure out of sort of land value capture generally and land value tax specifically. But, how do you think that London Rail improvements should be paid for, particularly now that London is going to be asked for big infrastructure projects to find more of the money ourselves rather than central government?
I think the future is of mixed funding packages, a bit like Crossrail. I think, there will need to be a continued role for some central government grant, whether that comes through DFT or Network Rail, and I think it's important that we continue to make and champion the case for that, but we do have to be realistic. That is not going to do all of the job. I think partly, some additional localisation again might help. The Treasury will always be suspicious of localising further taxation or revenue streams. But I think, where we can make a convincing case that by doing that, we are also strengthening the incentives to go for growth, that there can be benefits around that. I think where you are giving London government and London boroughs, if they are getting directly benefiting from some of these revenue streams, then they've got a much stronger incentive to make some of the local choices and trade-offs that would allow that. I think beyond that, as I said, Londoners in different forms are going to have to contribute in some way, but whether that is through the fares they pay, some of the local taxes, or through business taxes. I'm not delighted about that, but I think, realistically, we have to think of that as part of the package. And I think if we look at cities around the world, that is also what is happening there. Cities in, whether it's in France or in North America, people are coming to the conclusion that if you want better infrastructure, you've got to make a contribution towards it. And I think we should continue to be, a bit ambitious and creative about thinking about things that we haven't yet solved. Value capture. There is a strong, there is a, in principle, there are good reasons for seeing, it as being the right thing to do. There are, around transport schemes, for example, there are clearly very significant value uplifts that accrue to particularly residents, to be perfectly honest, who get windfall uplifts. the challenge we have always had is finding ways of capturing that, because of course, you know, as soon as we start to do that, it becomes very visible to people, and they don't feel it to be just, and you know, we tend to get political backlashes against that. You know, they see, they just see it suddenly being, you know, an additional tax bill for them. So I think there's a, you know, there is a gap at the practical level.
And I think there's, well, we've had those reports in the media saying TfL are considering a transport property charge. So presumably that would be something like that, which is collected out of, you know, an additional band on, you know, I don't know, band on council tax or something like that, or you know, part of the mayor's precept or something.
Yeah. Typically, you can do these things as annual charges or when transactions take place.
Do you think it's right as well that, because this didn't happen on Crossrail, but that authorities outside of London that benefit themselves should also be asked to contribute towards this, given that London boroughs will probably be asked to contribute towards this, or people living in London?
Well, that's exactly right. And if you look at Crossrail too, you know, you know, between 1/3 and 40% of the benefits are accruing to people outside London. So, you know, the idea that it is only London that should be contributing to this. And I think, you know, when we talk about the London contribution, actually, we should think of it more as a sort of contribution from the direct beneficiaries there. And certainly, you know, outside London, you run into some governance challenges inevitably. You know, it's slightly easier to do things on a GLA level as soon as you're looking at adding lots of additional districts. But I think absolutely, you know, those people who are benefiting outside London should also contribute towards it.
Helena, have you got any thoughts on how we should fund transport infrastructure in future?
I'm not a huge expert on this. I think just a sort of cautionary note, obviously value capture and sort of passing that on to residents is an obvious way of doing it. It's making sure that given all the pressures of the London housing market, we're not pricing people out of the market. And that's not just homeowners. We have to remember that a large proportion of people's rent, and that anything that's passed on to landlords will be passed down to tenants. So it needs to be a sort of carefully thought through sort of structured approach if there is any taxation passed on to residents. But I agree, some residents should be contributing as part of the opportunity that the accessibility affords them of a better transport system, even if they're not direct users.
Thank you.
Well, I think a starting point for this is to make the point that, which hasn't been where central government's been, that actually for rail, there are wider benefits from having a good rail network. For David's members having, you know, an opportunity of getting people to work and so on. And I say that because the policy of successive governments has been to move the burden, quote, of funding the railways from taxpayers to fare payers, and they've been very successful in that. I think fare payers would probably say that they don't feel they can see the benefits from this, particularly at the moment. But there are limits to that. We've gone further than most other countries have done because we haven't, I would argue, quantified and reckoned to pay for those wider benefits in terms of reduced congestion, pollution and so on from having a good rail network. So I think a starting point, which is a good way to approach the spending review next year that David referred to, is to make the case that there are wider benefits from having a good rail network. Having said that, in terms of how you pay for that, well, you know, the mayor has talked about road user charging. That would be a way, you know, if some of that money went into a better rail network with, before hastily said, better orbital bus links into that rail network to recognise the places that don't have railways. I have a colleague over there. And that does look like a sensible proposition. We're faced at the moment with a situation where the government is creating a roads fund, vehicle excise duty, none of which will come here, even though 500 million or so will be raised from London vehicle holders who pay. So there's an inherent unfairness. By the way, that's not just a London story, that's reflected elsewhere. And so there is road user charging, but as I've said already, there are more localised options. For example, development funding around the interchanges to enable the metroisation that we've talked about, the workplace parking levy in Hounslow and so on. So I think there are a range of options, and actually TfL are very across this in relation to looking at how other countries, other cities fund their public transport, and I think it's just a matter of seeing what will work.
I think with road user charging, TfL would potentially be able to borrow against the future revenues in order to fund upfront improvements to services. Just on the international front, do you have any examples you could give us from around the world of way other cities are doing this?
Well, and Niall might refer to this, but the French experience has been the versement transport, which is employers' payroll taxes that pay for the trams and other things in Strasbourg and the other cities that you mentioned. There are sales taxes, property levies. I think the San Francisco BART system was financed by a property tax within a quarter-mile radius of every station. So there is plenty of this around the place. Of course, we have here the Nine Elms Northern Line extension that's being funded through business rate uplifts. So we do have some, and the Crossrail experience as well. So we do have some knowledge here. But there are.
Send us if you've got a sort of. I don't know if you've got this in a sort of form. You could send us some international examples. It might be quite interesting.
Yeah, I can send. We actually had a survey done a few years ago. I can send you the link.
That'd be very useful. Thank you. No.
So this is a live issue for us. Before I'll talk about the tram extension and what we're doing about that at the moment. But I think the issue relating to taxation in terms of relying on the council tax system to enable that to happen, as one of my colleagues is saying, is a blunt instrument and it's very regressive. And it will adversely impact on those who are least able to pay. And that is specifically a problem in relation to the coincidence between lack of accessibility to transport and poorer communities. So the expectation that poorer communities should pay for the regional infrastructure or national infrastructure through a supplement through the council tax, I think is problematic. So if you take that forward, then what are the solutions? And it has to be some of the examples that Stephen's just mentioned in relation to land value capture, innovative financing mechanisms such as road pricing, but also in the context of this in terms of the some of the examples from Nottingham, which we've studied quite extensively for the tram. There was enormous community opposition to it and business opposition to it. But the tangible benefits of the tram itself means that is now going to continue. So they're using that mechanism for further infrastructure improvement beyond the tram. And as a consequence of that, it's seen as a viable mechanism to pay for the city and the wider region's infrastructure requirements as being fairer, because a part of it is workplace parking, it has a positive impact in terms of the externalities, in terms of discouraging unnecessary car journeys, it controls the use of land for car parking purposes, and then becomes virtuous in relation to releasing more land for economic development purposes. So those are the sort of arguments we need to learn from in terms of making this more acceptable. In the context of the tram, we've been in discussion with Transport for London. We very much welcome the commitment in the Mayor's Transport Strategy to investing a third of the cost. The question for us is where the other two-thirds are going to come from. The two boroughs who, to be put it bluntly, are a bit skint at the moment, are having to prioritise some of the investment themselves from their own resources, but that's not going to make it all. So we need to plug the gap in the context of what we need to do in terms of active conversation with the business community, residents, about how we fund it, and importantly, about the trade-offs in relation to development. And the expectation for development is already embedded in the tram extension. And as I mentioned earlier on, this is about remedial infrastructure. This is not about enhancing an already well-served part of London. This is also going to plug the gap for places that don't have access, have really poor public transport accessibility levels, and we will be expecting that discussion, that conversation to be about accepting more growth to enable that remedial infrastructure to be implemented in order that we can also improve it and future-proof it for that growth in the communities. That's a really tough political discussion. So the financing mechanisms for flow through that, I think, need to be dealt with as a public debate with all levels of government within London. It can't be just the boroughs doing that. It has to be the Mayor, Transport for London, this committee, having those debates about how we finance it, whatever those mechanisms are. There is room for also designated areas, so opportunity areas or growth zones, for example, in Croydon, for example, which is yielding more resources in relation to infrastructure improvement. And we're also examining that with support from government in terms of a potential designated area for the London Cancer Hub to enable us to pay for some of the infrastructure requirements, which is basically land value capture in terms of bringing forward that investment and allowing us to recycle some of the business rate expected revenue in order to pre-finance the infrastructure requirements. So there's active examples in London at the moment as well as the international ones.
I'm glad you mentioned Nottingham. I'm a former Nottingham resident, and the tram system is brilliant. And they've got a fantastic bus service because they're one of the only cities that never privatised their buses. They retain public ownership, and it shows. So they're a really good example of an integrated transport system. I just wondered finally, before I finish, if any of you've got any thoughts on the opportunities and challenges of the new rail networks enhancement pipeline, which sounds like a way the government is trying to get financing for infrastructure without paying for it itself.
I think there are some opportunities, really the things we've just talked about, of looking at developer and other finance packages through that pipeline. But we'll have, I mean, we know that there have been various proposals made. There is, of course, a Heathrow Southern Access proposition, which would
yes, it's quite interesting.
Which fits within that pipeline potentially. So we'll have to see whether any of that can actually pass Treasury rules about additionality and public sector borrowing requirement, because that's always been a stumbling block up to now for a lot of that kind of thing. If they do, if we can find a way around that, then it might be an opportunity for some of the schemes we've talked about to move in that direction.
David?
I've got a clear view on this, Tom, and that's whatever the game is, London should be playing it. So if there is a fund, let's find a way of, let's make sure we find a couple of things that we can be putting forward to it. I mean, the scheme that stands out for me at the moment as most likely to gain some success on that is the sort of the Heathrow Southern Rail. There are different proponents there, but actually that does look like a scheme that would both strengthen public transport access to the railway from the south, but would also actually provide some extra capacity and resilience for commuter rail as well. That would be reliant on government agreeing, to pay for that track and that track being available over time. So it does require some sort of commitment, but it should generate additional traffic that will essentially pay for it. So that does look like a good proposition. Beyond that, it looks a bit thin, to be perfectly honest. So it would be nice to see some additional proposals beyond that.
Okay.
Great. Florence next.
Just wanted to, I'm not sure if Tom touched on it, so apologies, but just looking at the fact that my family originates from Nigeria, and you can't get about in Nigeria and Lagos unless you have a car. So sometimes when friends and family come and visit from America as well, or Africa, they actually comment on how great our network system is, our transport system is in the UK, not just London, and the fact that you can move about. And I know that this may be a little bit contentious and divides opinion, but something around a tourism tax help fund some of that transport infrastructure. Has anyone done any work or research in terms of London First or anyone else?
I mean, I can't remember who's done it, but it has been looked at periodically. You are absolutely right. Some other cities do these things. I think on all of these new taxes, the key thing is to look at sort of city competitiveness in the round. So, you know, on Stephen's point, absolutely, you know, there are places that have payroll taxes and sales taxes. You know, I know sort of various members of ours would be really quite nervous about some of those because we probably have relatively higher employment and sales taxes relative to those jurisdictions. So it's important to look at it around. I think the general principle of giving city leaders and boroughs more powers and more options. You know, if you give, you know, if the Mayor of London had a dozen ways of, you know, a dozen potential levers to pull in terms of raising, you know, additional revenues, then, you know, they can think about what's most appropriate in their jurisdiction at any given time, given the economic conditions, given the sorts of scheme you're talking about. We had previously looked at hotel tax in the context of Crossrail 2. We sort of felt it didn't really fit with that because, you know, I think if you're raising money from that, it's got to be going to something that is seen as directly relevant to it. Crossrail 2, hotel tax felt a bit abstract, but I think the general principle of finding additional powers for sort of city leaders to be able to utilise is a sound one.
And I believe that was a part of the debate in one of the devolution discussions which was previously held in relation to, for example, tourist tax or hotel taxes and visitor taxation, which was rejected by government. But it seems to me as if that's an obvious source of revenue, which is marginal in terms of the total cost for a hotel room in London. You know, £1 a night when you're paying 250 quid, it's not going to be something which is going to break the bank.
Exactly. Quite right. Lovely. Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you all so much for your contributions this morning. It's been really appreciated. I know we've asked a couple of you for some further information, but Helena particularly, we haven't touched in as much detail on some of the work you've done around teleworking and teleconferencing and the impact on travel from your research. If there's extra stuff you'd like to send us to feed in, we'd be very grateful. So thank you, Niall, Stephen, Helena and David. You are free to leave us now. As we have Travel Watch coming before us next. So thank you very much. So members, can we note the terms of reference for our investigation as agreed by me as chair?
Agreed.
In consultation with party group leads. Can we note the report and discussion and delegate to me in consultation with party leads any related site visits? Agreed. Wonderful. We are now, whilst Travel Watch are coming down, can we do item 7, members, our committee work programme? Can we agree the remainder of the work programme for the year and delegate to me in consultation with party group leads to be the scope in terms of reference for our investigation into taxi and private hire services? And can we also agree to discuss the night tube at our next meeting in September?
Agreed.
And potentially, I probably should have said at the pre-meeting, I have written to Westminster asking them to come and talk to us about Oxford Street. Excellent. So depending when that did, it may well be we'd have to schedule it for part of that meeting. Okay. So, okay, no problem at all. Just getting set up. Wonderful. Right, let's move on to London Travel Watch Performance Report and Recruitment, item 6. First of all, can I welcome Arthur Leithley, who's the chair of London Travel Watch. Great to see you again. And Janet Cook, Chief Executive of Travel Watch. Welcome today. First of all, we want to look at your performance and look at the report we had before. So I know a number of members had some questions. Let's start off with Caroline.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. We, just picking up on the business plan, we've obviously seen the newer version, which came after the version we saw last October. And I was just wondering, I think I've been looking through, I think there's about 20 or 21 actions that were due for completion at the end of quarter 4 of 2017-18. And I just wonder how many of those have been completed.
I think you're talking about the business activity update that we sent. Yes, that informal one.
That's it. Yes.
Not our business plan for the year that we're now in. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes. The
I think everything on it, apart from what we updated the committee on, which was that our work around station travel planning had slipped because of lack of staff, but we're going to be picking that up later in the month into July. I think everything else is broadly on course. There have been a few changes. So, for example, our office accommodation, at the time we sent the report to you, we said we put an offer in on premises. Well, that one fell through because the landlord actually made a separate deal elsewhere. But having said that, we've now put an offer in, and literally as of yesterday, we've got heads of term. So we're about to start our due diligence. I think we can probably save about 20-25% on the current cost, but we'll start to evaluate it. Other than that, I think we're on course.
Well, that's good news about the accommodation. So, so you say that you're on course, and there's an awful lot of things here that have have timings that this was, I think, this was updated in February, and there were quite a lot of the things on it that weren't completed at that point. So are you saying that between February and now there are things that weren't complete on here that are now?
Caroline, I'm so sorry. We've met with Keith and Caroline in the meanwhile, and we gave them an updated version, which we updated in April. I'm really sorry, that's what I'm referring to. So I think everything that we were talking about was broadly on course. I think that the thing that we had delays on was actually promoting work around station travel planning, that the money that the train companies are meant to be putting into planning travel to stations to work on that had slipped along with our small stations work because we've been short-staffed. But once again, that we're picking up in July when we've got another member of staff starting in our policy team. Now, I think it was the key policy area where we'd slipped. And we were expecting to be commenting on, our board were expecting to get an official request from London Overground to potentially vary some of their ticket office opening hours, which I believe is something in their franchise. That slipped slightly because they decided to delay doing that until after the local elections. So we haven't yet received a request from them. So we haven't done that piece of work because obviously that's a response to them. Although we are expecting we'll probably get a request from them pretty fairly soon on that one. I think everything else.
Okay, so I mean, just to take one at random, the audit of with the train operating companies of their station travel plans, that fits into something we've just been talking about earlier, and analysing how those fit with the aspirations for improved station access by walking and cycling, particularly in outer London. What kind of output would there have been for that audit?
That's the one I said has slipped, but we'll be picking up in July. We've done the initial work around looking at what station travel planning is aiming to achieve. What we now need to do is have detailed discussions with each of the train companies to see what they're actually planning to do, what they should be doing, what they have done, and then see how we can bring together what's in the Mayor's transport strategy and link with what the train companies should be doing as well.
So you're expecting that work to be completed in July?
No, we're expecting that work to start in July. And to run through, I'd say, for another few more months.
Okay, so that is yes, quite a slip.
Yeah, that was the main slippage in terms of our policy.
Okay, but other things, the pulling together of updated statistics about major airports, those kind of things, that's all done.
That's in hand. Yes, we're on course with that. We've got the new statistics. And we are going to be updating our reports ready for publication by September.
Okay, so so the statistics part is done, and then the report will be completed in September. Yeah. Okay. And the other thing I was particularly interested in was the agreeing of the objectives for board members. Has that been completed?
Yes, I can talk to that, and we've set out the objectives for the board generally and for individual board members for the year.
And so that's all. That
is completely
sorted.
So
that's very good to hear. So of the things that were unable to be completed, that was the train access, travel planning. Was there anything else that was unable to be completed?
We had planned to promote rail devolution in the local terms when we meet with the Transport Minister. That meeting we haven't been able to get yet, but we've got it in a few weeks' time. So that's just delayed through circumstances beyond our control. Talked about the London Overground ticket office requests. Oh, and our bus station standards, piece of good practice work, recognising that these are major interchanges where there's very little laid down. So we've been doing some work to actually demonstrate what we think good practice is around bus stations. That work's been slightly delayed once again through staffing shortage. However, that's in hand, and we're hoping to have something that we can publish in the next 2 months. And we've got a draft report, but our board need to sign it off, and then it needs a couple of iterations.
These staffing shortages, is that something that's now resolved, or is that an ongoing
no, we're fully
situation?
staffed up. So as of 2 weeks' time, we'll be fully staffed in our policy team, back to what we were a couple of years ago. Great, okay, thank you.
Arthur, as Chair, do you want to, I guess, give us a general update on business planning and how you're going to improve it to make it more transparent going forward?
Yes, thank you, Caroline. First of all, I'd just like to say, so looking backwards over the last year, Stephen Locke was, of course, chair for much of the period, and I'd just like to extend my sort of gratitude to him for helping with the handover, which was, I think, pretty smooth, but also for his work that he's done before, so over just over 4 years. In terms of looking forward, obviously I'll be building on what Stephen has done and the board have done before. But I think there is an element of transparency here. We've talked about the business activity plan, which we introduced at the start of this year. And the intention of that is, just as you've picked up, Caroline, so we can have we can show a rolling programme of work, and we can see very clearly if there is slippage, and we've got to be very open about that. If anything has slipped for whatever reason, we can explain that. But I think perhaps in the past it's not been as clear as that as to when work is expected to be completed, and sometimes these are movable feasts to recognise that. But if there is any slippage, then we can explain it fully, and to yourselves, but also to other stakeholders if there's been any fallback. So that's really the basis of work, and I think the board now has developed this as part of their routine now when they're speaking to both to Janet and other officers. To really sort of delve into this and say, right, when is this going to happen? And to get an understanding, we do recognise that things do fall behind for all sorts of reasons. We have elections, all sorts of other elements, but we just got to know about that as it happens, so there are no surprises come the end of the year.
Okay. And Janet, over the last year, what do you think has been the biggest or couple of big successes that you would say you've had as Travel Watch? Where have you actually added value?
So the biggest success we've had in terms of influencing industry on behalf of passengers is probably the outcomes from the review we did of the impact on passengers of closing the ticket offices on the underground.
I'm going to come on to that in detail in a sec.
So I'd say that's huge because that's been picked up by the national rail industry as well, and so it's used as a good practice. So, but yes, so Arthur can talk on that. That one, I'd also say our work on interchanges, promoting best practice at interchanges and influencing other people, that's been very, very, we've seen lots of little improvements as a result of things that we've been calling for. Interestingly, the latest version of the rail and tube planning map, I don't know if you've looked at it, for the first time it actually includes walkable interchanges on that map. That's huge. I mean, we just saw it. We've been asking for that. We were told these things couldn't change. So that's the things that local people know, that's now on the map. I'd say we continue to influence through that. So I think our getting people together to talk about best practice, that's getting more and more powerful. So we're actually getting good practice out there, and people are taking it forward without us having to nag them. So I'd say those are probably the two key areas, Caroline.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Right, let's move on to ticket office closures. Keith.
Thank you, yes. Good morning. We're talking about ticket office closures. You did some work that was paid for by TfL, I believe, and in your report you do a review of it. My question is really, are you happy with the outcomes? Do you feel that TfL have taken on board all your recommendations, or is it maybe a little bit too optimistic in your review there?
I think things have moved forward quite significantly, even in just the last few weeks, Keith. I think we were a bit frustrated, if I'm honest, coming new to it, that we expected things to move rather more quickly than has actually happened. We made a lot of points about visibility of staff, the quality of information and accessibility for people, and we felt that was moving a bit slowly. We have heard just this week actually that many of the recommendations are now being implemented or have been, such as the number of staff in post, 325, making those staff available to passengers is absolutely crucial. So that's something that we pushed for, and we thought that wasn't moving at the pace that we'd hoped. That certainly has now. In terms of visibility of staff, again, we were told just yesterday that staff will have the tabards probably in red, and again, we thought that would be quite a simple thing to introduce. It seems to have taken a bit longer, partly because they want reversible tabards that can then be used in an emergency situation, so they can be reversed and to be orange. So those sorts of things have just taken a bit longer than we'd hoped. And in terms of help points, more help points being introduced so that, again, they're made very clear to passengers where they are. So I think if you'd asked me 3 months ago, I would say I was very frustrated. I think now there has been significant progress.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any timelines? They said that they're going to take on board what you've said around about tabards, around about more staff, around about staff being more visible, because it's not so much about having more staff. It's really about people being able to find the staff. Do you have any timelines on when they're going to actually deliver what they've promised?
Janet, did you have a particular time on that?
We had Mark Wilde to our policy committee yesterday and gave us those, and I don't actually have those notes in front of me, but I mean, the new uniforms, to make them more visible, we are talking weeks, I think, if not earlier. We can confirm this to you, Caroline, after the meeting. The staff, I believe, are already in post, and they've been piloting making the focal points which take the place of the ticket office, so passengers know where they can find someone if there's no one obviously on. They've been trialling those. I'd have to get back to you as to exactly what we've agreed with them in terms of when they'll come through. But you can certainly see them.
Timelines, yeah. So you will share those with
Oh yeah, we'll share them to you, yeah.
So what or do you intend to evidence that what they're saying has happened? So say, for instance, the new tabards will be out by, let's say, the end of July. Will you be doing any work to evidence that that's happened?
Yes. We'll be doing, sorry, I'm interrupting.
No, please.
We'll be doing informal monitoring, and that's part of the way our policy staff work. They'll be doing mystery shops of some of the key stations. We haven't got the resources, and it would be inappropriate to do the complete check, but we will be taking opportunities. And obviously we go through tube stations. Yeah, no, and we did actually agree with Mark Wilde yesterday that we will have another formal catch up on progress later in the year, I think it was.
Yeah. I'm sure if you let us know when the timelines are and when it's likely to happen, every member of the committee will help you in spot checking if the tabards are in place.
I'm sure we can inspect tabards until you finish.
Thank you.
Yeah, lovely. Let's look at finances. Tom.
Thank you, Chair. So just to be clear, you've got a new office sorted.
About to start our due diligence, Tom, but hopefully we've got it sorted.
Right, okay.
This is the third one we've pursued, but I'm fairly confident.
Okay. What were the main reasons for your expenditure being £74,000 higher than budgeted in 2017-18?
On the
budget, £74,000 higher.
Well, as it's broken down there, accommodation was, we hadn't budgeted for the massive increase that we got in our rent from the fire service, so that's a key part of that. We also overspent on our supplies and services budget. Some of that we planned to because we did some research into the needs of season ticket holders, which was, and we'd earmarked money from the previous year's reserves to actually fund that, so it was about 17,000, I think. The balance of that was consultancy fees to support us in a staff restructure, which is actually funded from the money that we got from the rail delivery group. That money helped to fund it. We did say to them that if we're going to input to help to develop the Ombudsman scheme, we need to restructure because we can't free up senior resources otherwise. So those are two of the key reasons. We had a change in our depreciation policy as well, but critically it's the accommodation and the extra supplies and services.
Okay, so assuming it all goes well with this office that you're hoping to sign a contract on, that will be those extra costs will be coming to an end. And okay, So there's a one-off costs.
So we're hoping for a break-even budget this year.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, lovely. Keith, you wanted to come in?
Thank you, yes. I'm looking at your finance performance sheet. I don't know if you've got one of those in front of you. Can I start by asking, we have here original budget. We then have a second column saying revised budget. Why did you feel the need to have a revised budget?
I think we did. I think this is just something in terms of the convention, how we send our figures through to you. We didn't ever formally revise our budget for the year. This is sort of custom and practice that this is the way that we're required to put the figures in.
Okay. Looking at the income section under other income, you put that you've got £77,982 in other income, and that seems to have come from cost recovery for set-up of a new ombudsman service and the review of the closure of TfL ticket offices.
That, I'm afraid, is a mistake. What it should have said is what it says in paragraph 6.6 of the narrative, which is actually we did get some additional income from the GLA to offset the costs of a maternity leave.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
That's because I was going to say, because as far as I was aware, you were aware of the ticket office income.
Yeah, no, that was last year. I'm really sorry. We
Let's answer that question.
We like something there for you to find.
So then, so you had some money for maternity leave and the setting. Are you able to break those down?
I think it was approximately 40,000. I haven't got the exact figures. Yeah. Approximately 40,000 for the costs of the maternity leave, and the balance was cost recovery from the rail delivery group.
40k each, roughly. Okay, that's fine. I appreciate that you were hit round the back of the head with the accommodation costs, which you may or may not have seen coming. But you've actually managed to overspend in every single budget area.
Yes.
For that, to me, suggests poor management.
We also had money coming in, so that, for example, the overspend on supplies and services, part of it was planned because we'd earmarked some of the reserves carried forward from the surplus from the previous year because we hadn't finished the research on season ticket holders. So that part of that was planned. And the second part of it was essentially the consultancy costs associated with reviewing our staff.
Yeah, if it was planned, why wasn't it in the budget?
It came during the year. We hadn't, when we put the budget bid in, we hadn't actually planned to do a staff restructure, and we certainly hadn't planned to have to do it in the way that we did. But the fact that we got the additional money from the rail delivery group meant that we could actually fund support to actually properly check our skills and basically do a lot of staff interviewing.
Now I'm a bit confused. You're saying that you got some extra money in that you weren't expecting to get in?
Not at the stage that we put our budget bid in, no.
But where is that shown? You have an original budget.
Yeah.
You obviously chose not to do a revised budget when you knew you were having some more money in. And then in your actual spend income, you've not shown that money coming in. If you said you've had some money in, you haven't shown it on your accounts. How does that happen?
We put it in under extra on actual income. Sorry, Keith.
We put it under where?
Actual income 77,982.
So it's the other.
Oh, so it's in with that lot as well.
Offsets it. Sorry.
So it wasn't. So what you said earlier wasn't true then. You didn't. It wasn't 40 grand for the maternity, and the rest of it was for the ombudsman. There was another item as well. And how much was that?
Sorry, the two items of the two items of cost recovery were the setup of an ombudsman scheme, the cost recovery, and the additional money we got from the GLA to offset our maternity costs.
And that's what you use to offset your increase in supply?
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. So I didn't quite understand what you were
Yeah,
saying.
sorry.
So I said I was a bit confused. Right, that's fine. I think that
Okay with that?
covers me. Yeah, no, that's fine. Oh no, sorry, there was one other question. And you probably don't have to under the accounting structures, but you make reference to reserves. I just wonder what your reserves were currently.
Free reserves at the end, and we're just, the audits, the financial audit just being finalised at the moment. Our free reserves are in the region of 73,000, I think. And we have
other
earmarked...
reserves that are earmarked, yeah.
Yeah, and we've earmarked about 25,000 of that, part for training costs and development costs associated with the restructure, and part for IT costs, partly to update, but particularly because of complying with the requirements of the changes to the data protection rules. And we've identified some changes we need to make, for example, to some of our IT programs so that we can automatically anonymise data and things like that.
Very sensible. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, just to reassure the committee, the board has looked at these and said we do, for next year, we want to have a reduced reserve. But I think in view of the accommodation changes and the IT changes as a one-off, I think it's reasonable.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other members indicating. Thank you very much, Arthur and Janet, for coming before us today. And I think we're setting up a meeting with the board, with members, lead members of this committee. It will be open to all members, but to come and meet you all and have a catch-up. So can we note the report and discussion? In addition, can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with group leads to agree the recruitment process for the 3 London Travel Watch board positions which come up at the end of this year? Is that okay, members? Lovely, thank you. And we'll be in touch about that and getting dates.
We look forward to meeting you informally.
The date of our next meeting is our extra meeting on Monday, the 25th of June at 11 in the chamber, which is going to be with Govia Thameslink Railway and Network Rail. I've got no other urgent business. Thank you, members, very much indeed.
Thank you.